past couple weeks I've had my hands on the ROG Ally X, and not only have I been testing and comparing it to the previous version of the ROG Ally, which is a video I've already put up, but I also wanted to take a look at how it stacks up and compares to their current top-of-the-line Steam Deck option with the 1TB Steam Deck OLED. And it's very interesting to see how this update has affected that landscape. A portion of today's video is sponsored by Sword of Convallaria. So I don't really want to drag out this intro very much and just get right into what makes these systems different and which one might be a better fit for you if you're in the market for a PC handheld. And the first thing I want to focus on is something that has been kind of a recurring big point about the differences between the Steam Deck and the ROG Ally and really any other PC handheld out there is SteamOS versus Windows. Valve's approach to making their own PC handheld was, instead of relying on a traditional PC OS, they instead took a version of Linux and wrapped it in their own OS called SteamOS that is built for providing something that feels closer to a more traditional dedicated game console experience. You can do things like boot it up in a desktop mode if you want to do some fancier adjustments and changes and do things like browse the internet, but ultimately whenever you first start it up, it is prioritizing a UI experience that is built to feel like a traditional dedicated handheld, which is in my mind is a considerably more user-friendly experience. By comparison, the ROG Ally X and many other PC handhelds out there instead rely on just simply using Windows, while also adding a bit of their own software on top of that to help bridge the gap the best they can. In the case of the Ally X, this would be Armoury Crate SE. And the problem I have with using Windows as an OS is just simply the fact that it wasn't really designed for this kind of input. And applications like Armoury Crate SE do a very good job of helping bridge that gap as much as they can, but ultimately there's just going to be this greater level of friction that does not exist by comparison with SteamOS on the Steam Deck. For instance, even something as simple as getting the system set up in the first place, right? With Steam Deck, right away you're able to dive into the store or look at the library of games you already own on Steam, download them and begin playing right away. Whereas with the ROG Ally, yeah, some of these apps are pre-installed for ease of use like Steam or the Xbox app, but you still have to manually open those up in Windows, log in, pick the games you want to download and do there, and once they're installed on the machine, you have a very simple way of looking at your full library of everything installed on the system using Armoury Crate, and that makes a much smoother experience once it's all up and running. But there is that just little bit of extra work getting it started. And also just generally speaking, between the experience of using SteamOS and Windows, I have found that because of Windows just simply being Windows, there's going to be more opportunities and times where you find yourself having to just troubleshoot very odd specific issues that might be cropping up for a particular game or situation. There are, however, very large upsides to this choice as well, namely compatibility. In the case of Steam Deck and SteamOS, you are limited to specific games that you're able to access and play. There are ways of working around and accessing other services and stuff if you want, but by default, the main goal of this machine really is you're just accessing the Steam store, you're just downloading the games that you've purchased via Steam. There are specific games that, despite being something available on Steam, you're not actually able to run on Steam Deck specifically because of compatibility issues, and that is a library that's constantly being worked on and expanded, but it is a problem you can run into. Whereas with the Ally, it's running Windows. So if something runs smoothly on Windows, it's going to work on the Ally. You might have to put a little more effort here and there in order to make sure that the controls and everything work out just right, but at the simple core of whether or not a game is going to run on it, if it works on Windows, it's going to work on the ROG Ally. And this also makes sure that not only are you able to access any games you might own on Steam that may not be compatible on Steam Deck, but it also opens up all the other platforms. If for whatever reason there are games that you want to play that are only on the Epic Game Store, that's where you happen to own them. If there's stuff you want to get on Xbox, if you want to play games via Xbox Game Pass for PC, this is all stuff that is much easier to access and use by default on the ROG Ally than on Steam Deck. And in fact, while we're on the subject, a great example of this, something that I've been able to play on both these systems, because thankfully it's available on Steam, at least in demo form right now, and I've been able to play it on my ROG Ally as well, is today's sponsor, Sword of Convallaria. I've always considered myself primarily a handheld gaming fan, and some of my fondest memories from growing up were playing RPGs on my Game Boy, especially tactical RPGs, and was very formative in terms of my tastes today and the games that I still look out for and enjoy. And Sword of Convallaria is a new game that is absolutely hitting me in the nostalgia. This is a tactical gacha RPG that's coming to mobile, but is also available on PC, where I think PC handhelds like the Ally X are just a perfect fit. And in fact, when they very first released a demo for this months ago, I checked it out on my Steam Deck. And the mechanics and visuals of this game just perfectly recapture the tactical RPGs that I grew up loving, with a pixel aesthetic that has been modernized in some ways so that it looks like a brand new shiny game, but it really instills that old school retro vibe at the same time. time. Sword of Convallaria will have you collecting characters, customizing them, building out your squads, and making tactical and storyline decisions that will shape the future of the game's world. And I think one of the things that really ties all of this together beautifully is that the score for the game is actually composed by Hitoshi Sakamoto, who worked on some of the most foundational games of this genre, including Final Fantasy Tactics and the Ogre Battle series. Again, this game is coming to both PC and mobile, and it is releasing today. In fact, as this video is going live, the game is now available to play, so make sure to check it out on your preferred platform, or check out my link down below in the description to learn more. Okay, so moving past OSs, the next thing I really want to focus on with these devices is ergonomics, because this was something that previously, to me, was just a straight up win for the Steam Deck. I just found it to be the overall much more comfortable system to use when compared to the ROG Ally, and the Ally X has considerably closed that gap. The original Ally just had a few choices and things that didn't feel quite as right. Button and stick quality, while solid, wasn't the absolute best. The grip shape was a little more awkward and much shallower and wasn't particularly comfortable, especially compared to the Steam Deck. And now, with the changes the Ally X has made, it's much more interesting. The Ally X is a very comfortable controller. I will say that in some respects, I think the Steam Deck still wins out just a little bit. For instance, in terms of grip shape, the Steam Deck still has a slightly more pronounced one that I do find to be more comfortable for prolonged periods of time. There's also a pretty big difference in the button layouts for these two systems. Steam Deck has made it so that, they had to move everything up to the top in order to make space for the touchpads that I personally don't really love, whereas the Ally X relies on a more traditional layout of how the ABXY, D-pad, and everything are oriented compared to the sticks. I think thanks to the larger grip style of the Steam Deck, it ends up still being a very comfortable experience, but sometimes reaching over for something like the D-pad can be a little bit more awkward, which feels more convenient on the Ally. Whereas on the right side of things with the ABXY and sticks, honestly, while they are different, and I think at first glance Ally feels like it would be the more comfortable of the two, it actually works out pretty evenly between them as far as comfort goes. Ultimately, when talking about ergonomics and comfort, I do think the Steam Deck is still just a little bit more ahead thanks to its much larger grip shape that also contributes to having a much larger body in general, but is so much closer than it was before. Whereas looking at the old Ally versus the Steam Deck, I would have said the Steam Deck OLED was just flat out by far the more comfortable of the two. It's now close enough to where, yeah, it's a point in Steam Deck's favor, but it's not really that much farther ahead. And then there's the matter of how well these systems run their games, and in this situation, this is where, for the most part, the Ally X does have the advantage, particularly in the case of the X because, again, it is the slightly more expensive option, and compared to the original Ally, it's even received a bit of performance tweaks, but the original Ally was already a more powerful system than the Steam Deck, and that gap has just widened even more with the Ally X's improved RAM. When using both systems and you're just relying on them being able to use as much power as possible and you're not trying to limit their power consumption, running games that are particularly demanding ultimately are just going to have far better experiences on the Ally X than on the Steam Deck. There are certainly going to be less demanding titles where ultimately it doesn't matter which of these systems you could run them on because you could just play that on a potato and it's fine. Animal Well, for instance, is not going to be particularly difficult for either of these systems to run, but if you are interested in playing some of the bigger budget, expensive games that also take a lot more power to run, the Steam Deck OLED is going to be sufficient enough to be able to run these games, but you're going to see better experiences on the Ally. For instance, Cyberpunk 2077. This game has a built-in benchmark, so I find that to be a very easy way of just getting a quick shorthand of how well it's running in each system. And when putting them in the same performance profile of using the Steam Deck settings while also running at 720p, the Steam Deck is hitting about an average of 48 frames per second, whereas the Ally X is hitting 65. Not only that, but because the Ally actually has a 1080p display, you could choose to bump that up to 1080 using all the same settings, and you'd be getting a performance of roughly around 45 frames per second, meaning that hitting a higher resolution of 1080, the ROG Ally is just barely at a lower frame rate than what the Steam Deck is doing at 720. And I think somewhere else worth really bringing attention to that is in docked situations, because the Steam Deck might be capable of handling some of these games in handheld mode at 720p, if you also make some sacrifices in some places as far as, visual fidelity goes. But if you want to also be able to use this system docked and play games that way as well, the Ally is going to be able to tackle that situation a lot better. You're still not necessarily going to be doing these games at 4K, but they're going to look a lot better at 1080p on an Ally than they would on a Steam Deck. Something else that plays an interesting role in comparing these two though, and this is where the Steam Deck actually, I think, think comes out a bit more ahead, is their built-in displays. Ultimately, the ROG Ally is absolutely able to play games at a higher performance profile than the Steam Deck, and in fact, it even has a more powerful display, for instance, being 1080p rather than 720. It has a 120Hz refresh rate, whereas the Steam Deck OLED is at 90. And so in those situations where you're able to leverage the full power of the system and run games in 1080p, you're going to have an ultimately crisper image than the Steam Deck OLED is capable of. What I think is an interesting benefit for the Steam Deck OLED, however, one, the display is slightly larger. It's a 7.4-inch screen versus the 7-inch screen on the Ally. It is also using a different aspect ratio of 16:10 rather than 16:9, so you have a little bit of options with what aspect ratio you're running your games in. But the key thing here for me, OLED. For those games where crispness and high fidelity isn't necessarily as important, and instead we're focusing more on art style and use of colors, I absolutely think the OLED can lead to what, in my mind, is a better looking experience. The way it's able to have true blacks and the way that saturated colors really come across just really flourishes on an OLED display that you're not really getting out of the LCD display on the ROG Ally. Again, for something like Baldur's Gate, I think the slightly smaller screen and higher peak resolution is going to result in a better looking experience, but for other stuff, especially indie games with things like Hades, yeah, you're going to have a slightly softer image with a 720p display that's also larger, but the colors and the way that all of that comes to life on the display just looks fantastic. One other aspect worth considering, though, outside of just simply how well games run, is also how long you can play them. The battery life on the original ROG Ally was not fantastic. It was actually the same in terms of capacity as the original Steam Deck, but because the Steam Deck's average power draw is so much lower, you weren't eating through it nearly as quickly, whereas, if you're using turbo mode on the Ally, it's gonna burn through that battery super quick. And in the case of the newer Steam Deck OLED and the ROG Ally X, both of them saw battery increases, but the one on the Ally X is considerably more substantial. In terms of just rating them by watt hours, the Steam Deck OLED has a 50 watt hour battery, whereas the Ally X has an 80 watt hour. The Ally does tend to draw more power just innately because of the more powerful components, and so, when you're pushing the systems, you might still be able to burn through that battery pretty quickly, but when you're playing it on lower profile settings and really matching the kind of power draw that the Steam Deck has, that total playtime is going to add up to a lot more and is going to end up being able to play for more hours between charges. Ultimately, after seeing all the updates and changes with the Ally X and how that stacks up to the Steam Deck OLED, while I am walking away with some similar opinions that I've had in the past as far as why I like each one more for certain situations, there's a lot more going on in favor of the Ally X than there was previously. You do end up having to spend more money because of this higher priced up model, but if we're talking about looking at more expensive system options, $650 for the Steam Deck OLED with a 1TB storage versus the Ally X being $150 more, offering the same storage with a higher resolution display, higher battery life, and much more performance to back it up. If power is something you're interested in, that's probably going to be the better way to go. I still think there's a very strong argument for the Steam Deck OLED if you're more interested in playing smaller titles where you don't necessarily need the same power level to get performance out of them, especially because, again, I think SteamOS is ultimately a more user-friendly experience for a lot of people. And while I'm mainly talking about the top-line options here, you can make the gap between these systems a bit more price-wise, like by looking at the mid-range Steam Deck OLED, where you're losing out on some storage, jumping down to 512, but you're getting the same performance and everything out of the system at a more affordable price point. Ultimately, the most important question here is what kind of games you're interested in playing on the systems. The more bigger budget, expensive, high performance stuff, the more reasons why you're probably going to want to look a little more at an Ally X. But the more simpler, smaller scale, older games, indie titles, that kind of thing, the Steam Deck will be more than proficient enough while leveraging a couple unique benefits like its OS and that OLED display that the Ally is not offering. I will say for my own personal cases, the Steam Deck OLED has been my primary system since its release, and I'm going back and forth right now between them, and particularly because of some of the games that I'm playing. For instance, I was doing a bunch of Baldur's Gate 3 on the Steam Deck OLED, and that experience has just been much better on the ROG Ally, and that's where I ended up finishing the game on. But I've also now been playing a bunch of Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance, and that game is not nearly as demanding and runs pretty solidly on the Steam Deck and benefits from that OLED display. So I keep playing games that I'm up to date with where one feels just like a slightly better fit than the other. In the long run, though, I do think I see myself leaning more towards the direction of focusing on the Ally. So those are my thoughts on ROG Ally X versus Steam Deck OLED. If you're interested in learning more about these or picking one up, I do have links posted down below in the description. As always, if you enjoyed this video, hit the thumbs up button to let me know. Subscribe if you haven't yet. I do want to thank Sword of Convallaria once again for sponsoring today's video. Make sure to check out that link down below in the description as well, and I will see you all later.